This podcast is brought to you by B2B Better. Most B2B podcasts rack up downloads, but they never move the needle on pipeline. At B2B Better, we build own media systems that sales teams actually use to close deals. We've helped companies turn their podcasts into revenue engines, shortening sales cycles, improving outbound reply rates, and directly influencing millions in pipeline. So if you're tired of content that looks good on paper, but doesn't drive business results, visit b2b-better.com to see how we do it differently. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Pipe Dream. And like yesterday, we are taking a question from our audience. And a reminder, if you have any questions on what it means to invest in a audience-led marketing strategy and turn your point of view into pipeline, you can send us questions in to the address that we are dropping in the show notes of this episode, or of course you can just connect with me on LinkedIn and share it there. Question from our listener is, I think we used to think of podcasts as long-form audio shows. Increasingly, the rise of short-form media has now meant that podcasts are often consumed in brief video segments across things like Instagram Reels, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts. In your view, do B2B podcasts need to be built with those spaces in mind, or are they fundamentally consumed in different ways? Yeah, it's a great question. I think it touches on a couple of important points. So, the word podcast, I think, is going through a bit of a kind of shift in understanding. 5 years ago, when you talked about podcasts, what you were typically talking about were audio only, long form, narrative or interview-based driven content. That largely, if you were delivering them as a brand, like a corporate brand, existed to service your top of funnel, right? Build brand awareness. Today, we live in a world where actually the definition of the word podcast can change depending on who it is that you are speaking to, right? And where it is changing into, I think for the majority of people, is when we're talking about podcasts, what we're actually talking about is editorialized, serialized, kind of rich media thought leadership, which is a bit of a mouthful, but, unpack that. Often video-based, often kind of repurposed and cut up into different formats, and often expected to not be consumed in its whole, right? For a 60-minute episode being watched or listened to from start to finish, but actually with the right strategic repurposing, outputs of that podcast, be they clips, be they blog posts, be they emails, be they long form, whatever, every moment, every touch point counts towards the overall consumption of the podcast. How we think about it here at B2B Better is that these platforms that are emerging and increasingly take up mindshare in the daily lives of B2B buyers, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, Instagram, etc., are really fertile ground to expose your content to new and different audiences. And in fact, without them, your podcast or your show will experience slow and perhaps even stunted growth. Why? If you are approaching your podcast as an audio-only entity, while there is value in that, what we have found is that brands need to work 10 times harder in order to get that podcast in front of their prospective clients. Because Apple and Spotify, unless you can develop partnerships with them as a platform, or you invest heavily in, I guess, like earned media, podcast partnerships, guest placements, etc., they don't have great organic discovery. It is hard to surface a new podcast into Spotify and Apple purely on organic. Unlike YouTube Shorts, TikTok, and Instagram, where particularly with YouTube Shorts and TikTok, we consider them, the Facebook of 10 to 15 years ago when it comes to organic discovery. You can see, and we do see, brands with next to no following on those platforms placing clips and seeing them get hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of views purely from organic. The algorithm works much better in your favor on those platforms. And so you need to be thinking about how can you cut and turn your podcast into assets that are usable in those locations. However, and I feel like I've said however a couple of times here, it's not enough to just have a 60-minute long-form interview and allow AI to cherry pick moments for you from what is otherwise kind of random conversation between 2 or 3 individuals. The process of cutting clips for YouTube Shorts, Instagram, and TikTok starts way back in the scripting process, way before we ever sit down and actually record anything with a guest. You need to, as part of your scripting process, be thinking strategically and editorially about, well, what kind of sound bites, what kind of social clips do we feel will resonate on these platforms, on YouTube Shorts, Instagram, and TikTok? And then how do we script questions to ensure that we are maximizing our chances of getting those sound bites when it comes to the post-production process? This can even extend into the interview itself. You know, when you've scripted a question that you already know you are going to be cutting into a social clip, if that question is asked and the guest is maybe looking around the room, or they stutter, or they kind of get to an answer but in a roundabout way, it's your job as the brand, as the producer of the show, to, you know, either stop the interview at that point, or at the end of the interview, make the guest or the host give that answer again. Give them the instruction. Hey, what you said there was really interesting. We want to turn that into a clip. What you said in 3 minutes, I need you to condense down to 45 seconds. Just give us that soundbite. And so you need to work harder, you know, rather than just relying on, you know, fixing it in post or AI to kind of magically give you the clips that may or may not exist when you get to the final edit. So to sum up, you know, should we be thinking about YouTube Shorts, Instagram, and TikTok as distribution channels? Absolutely. The organic discovery alone and exposing your podcast to new audiences on those platforms is worth it. And second, don't leave it to fate for these clips to emerge out of your podcast recordings. Script them in advance, brief the guest and the host exactly what it is that you are looking for and that you are turning into clips, and, you know, hold them to that. Stop them, make them re-record, because the content at the end is too valuable to waste. All right, so that's it for this episode of Pipe Dream. If you have any questions about how to turn your point of view into pipeline, or how to build an effective podcast, we'd love to hear them. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, Jason Bradwell, or send me an email at jason@b2b-better.com, and we'll answer it on a future episode of Pipe Dream. All right, until next time, see you then.